Welcome to the Week 10 lecture. This week I'll be talking about the early national period that followed the War of 1812. Specifically, we'll be looking at the political landscape in that time period. After the War of 1812, a wave of nationalism swept across the United States, along with a recognition of the weaknesses the war had exposed, such as a poor infrastructure and a bankrupt treasury. This realization inspired a series of infrastructure projects and economic policies collectively known as the American System. Advocates of the American system, like Henry Clay of Kentucky, believed it was time for the United States to move beyond an export-reliant agrarian economy and instead focus on promoting domestic manufacturing and internal improvements to ensure economic independence and prosperity. The first component of the American system was the chartering of the Second Bank of the United States in 1816. This national bank was designed to issue a stable national currency and centralized credit, unlike the fragmented state banking system that issued varying forms of state-specific money. By regulating currency and controlling inflation, the Second Bank aimed to bring financial stability to the country. It was also expected to facilitate economic growth by providing a reliable financial system that could support investment and expansion in the emerging industrial sector. The second major element of the American system was the introduction of tariffs designed to protect American industries from foreign competition. These tariffs placed taxes on imported goods, making foreign products more expensive and encouraging Americans to buy domestically produced items. Proponents of this policy believed the resulting growth in domestic industries would not only stimulate the economy, but also create jobs for American workers. Additionally, the revenue generated from these tariffs was expected to fund future government projects, particularly internal improvements. The third and final component of the American system focused on these internal improvements, specifically the construction of roads, canals, and other transportation infrastructure. Advocates argued that better transportation networks would promote economic development by lowering the cost of shipping goods and increasing market access for farmers and manufacturers. These improvements were also seen as a way to foster national unity by physically connecting the different regions of the country, making it easier for people, goods, and ideas to flow across state lines. However, this part of the plan was met with less success, as bills supporting internal improvements often failed to pass through Congress. Consequently, much of the responsibility for infrastructure development remained with state and local governments rather than the federal government. Ultimately, the American system aimed to create a self-sufficient, prosperous, and interconnected United States. While it had varying degrees of success, its focus on national economic development and the protection of American industries had a long-lasting impact on the country's trajectory, even as debates over the role of government in economic matters continued. The Missouri Compromise, enacted in 1820, was a pivotal legislative agreement designed to address the contentious issue of slavery's expansion as the United States moved westward. As new territories became candidates for statehood, the balance of power between free and slave states in the Senate was a central concern. The compromise had three main components. First, Missouri was admitted to the Union as a slave state, which threatened to upset the balance between free and slave states. To counter this, Maine was admitted as a free state, maintaining the delicate equilibrium. Lastly, the compromise established the 36-degree 30-minute parallel as a boundary across the Louisiana Territory, north of which slavery would be prohibited, with the exception of Missouri. This legislative fix temporarily settled disputes over slavery's expansion, but did not resolve the deep-seated tensions between the North and South over the institution of slavery itself. At the same time, the Panic of 1819 marked the first major financial crisis in the United States. Triggered by a range of economic factors, including post-war adjustments, land speculation, and the mismanagement of the Second Bank of the United States, the panic led to widespread bank failures, unemployment, and foreclosures. As agricultural prices plummeted and industrial output declined, Americans experienced a severe economic contraction. The panic highlighted the fragility of the young nation's economic system and exposed the dangers of speculative bubbles, weak regulation, and dependence on international markets. The panic left a lasting impact, especially among Western farmers and landowners who bore the brunt of the economic fallout. Both the Missouri Compromise and the Panic of 1819 raised enduring political issues that would continue to shape American history. The Missouri Compromise exposed the underlying issue of slavery's expansion, which would resurface repeatedly in the decades to come. While the compromise maintained a balance for the moment, it failed to resolve the larger question of whether new slaveries would allow slavery, ultimately leading to further political crises like the Compromise of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act. These events built momentum toward the secession of the Southern states and the Civil War. The issue of states' rights also came to the fore. The Missouri Compromise sparked debates over the federal government's authority to regulate slavery in the territories, questioning how much control the national government should wield over states' decisions. This conflict between state sovereignty and federal power became central to the political discourse of the 19th century, and it reached its zenith during the secession crisis. The Panic of 1819 also triggered debates about the role of government in the economy, revealing vulnerabilities in the American economic system. Questions about how much the government should intervene in the economy to stabilize it persisted, contributing to ongoing discussions over the banking policy, particularly the debate about the national bank. Economic crises such as the Panic of 1837 further fueled these debates, leaving an imprint on U.S. politics and policy decisions well into the 19th century. Both the Missouri Compromise and the Panic of 1819 shaped the trajectory of political conflict and economic debates, leaving unresolved issues that would continue to influence the United States. The Republican revival that coalesced around Andrew Jackson was driven by a combination of strategic political organization and reaction to the controversial results of the 1824 election. One of the key figures behind this resurgence was Martin Van Buren, a brilliant political tactician from New York. Van Buren saw an opportunity to unite Jackson's supporters and transform them into a cohesive political force. His efforts were crucial in the establishment of the Democratic Party, which would become a dominant force in American politics under Jackson's leadership. Van Buren worked tirelessly to rally Jackson's base, recognizing that Jackson's populist appeal could serve as a foundation for a broader political movement. At the center of this revival was Andrew Jackson himself. A military hero from the War of 1812, Jackson had a strong appeal among ordinary Americans, particularly those in western and southern states. In the 1824 presidential election, Jackson won the most popular votes and the most electoral votes, yet he was not awarded the presidency. This was due to the fact that none of the four major candidates, Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William H. Crawford, and Henry Clay, had secured a majority of electoral votes. As a result, the election was decided by the House of Representatives, as stipulated by the Constitution. The outcome of the election became one of the most controversial in American history. Known as the corrupt bargain, the deal that emerged from the House's deliberation would fuel Jackson's drive for the presidency in the next election. Speaker of the House Henry Clay, who had finished fourth in the electoral race, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, ensuring Adams's victory. In return, Adams appointed Clay as his Secretary of State, a position widely seen as a stepping stone to the presidency at that time. Many of Jackson's supporters believed this to be a backroom deal that undermined the will of the voters. This corrupt bargain would become a rallying cry for Jacksonians, who saw the election as a betrayal of democratic principles. These events, coupled with Jackson's personal popularity and the organizational skills of figures like Van Buren, laid the foundation for the formation of the Democratic Party. It was not just a reaction to the perceived injustice of 1824, but also a carefully crafted movement that spoke to the grievances of ordinary Americans who felt alienated by the political elite. John Quincy Adams's presidency from 1825 to 1829 was defined by significant events and policies that ultimately contributed to his defeat in the 1828 election. While Adams sought to implement ambitious programs to strengthen the country, his administration faced deep political opposition and personal attacks that eroded his public support. One of the key influence on Adams's administration, although it predated his presidency, was his role in shaping the Monroe Doctrine during his tenure as Secretary of State under James Monroe. The doctrine, issued in 1823, declared that the U.S. would oppose any further European colonization or intervention in the Americas. This policy established the United States as a defender of the Western Hemisphere and was a cornerstone of American foreign policy. However, while the Monroe Doctrine was hailed as a success internationally, its impact on domestic politics during Adams's presidency was limited. It did little to address the internal issues that were more pressing for voters. Domestically, Adams focused on internal improvements as a major part of his vision for the nation's future. He supported federal funding for infrastructure projects such as roads, canals, and bridges, seeing these as essential to uniting the country and promoting economic growth. His belief in a strong, centralized government leading such efforts, however, ran into significant opposition. Many in Congress, especially states' rights advocates and strict constructionists, argued that the federal government overstepped its bounds in funding internal improvements. This clash between Adams's vision of an integrated national economy and the preference for state-level control weakened his legislative agenda and limited his effectiveness. During Adams's presidency, political opposition began to formalize around Andrew Jackson, leading to the creation of the Democratic Party. Jackson, who had lost the controversial 1824 election to Adams, became the figurehead for a populist movement that positioned itself against what it viewed as Adams's elitist and out-of-touch policies. Martin Van Buren and other Jackson supporters organized a strong political machine that portrayed Adams as disconnected from the common man, contrasting him with Jackson's image as a rugged, self-made war hero. This new political alignment led to the formation of the Democratic Party, which would become a powerful force against Adams's administration. The election of 1828 was one of the most vicious in American history, marked by personal attacks and intense partisan division. Adams was portrayed as an elitist, someone more concerned with intellectual pursuits than with the needs of ordinary Americans. His opponents used his previous diplomatic service and refined background against him, framing him as out of touch with the working class. In contrast, Andrew Jackson was promoted as a man of the people, and his supporters capitalized on his war hero status. The Democratic Party, now fully mobilized and organized, executed a sophisticated and wide-reaching campaign that appealed directly to the frustrations of the common voter. The smear campaigns, combined with Adams's inability to push through his agenda, contributed to his defeat as Jackson won decisively in 1828. In the end, Adams's vision for a stronger, more unified national economy through federal programs and his association with political elites were no match for the populist momentum that Jackson and the Democrats had built. His presidency, while marked by significant policy efforts, ultimately succumbed to the rising tide of Jacksonian democracy. At the national level, the Jacksonian Democrats and their rivals, including the Whig Party and various Democratic factions, confronted widening differences between the North and South through a series of contentious policies and legislative maneuvers. These differences primarily centered on issues of economic policy, slavery, and states' rights, and the ways these policies played out revealed the deepening rift between the two regions. One method the Jacksonian Democrats used to consolidate power was the spoils system, where political supporters were rewarded with government positions. While this helped solidify loyalty within the Democratic Party, it also intensified political tensions as factions within the party, along with regional interests, jockeyed for these appointments. This patronage system sometimes led to conflicts, particularly when Northern and Southern Democrats disagreed on key issues. One such issue was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their lands in the Southeast to areas west of the Mississippi River. The policy, driven by Southern interests in expanding cotton cultivation, disproportionately affected the South and sparked division, as Northern reformers and some political figures opposed the cruel treatment of Native populations. The act led to the infamous Trail of Tears, with thousands of Native Americans suffering as they were relocated to territories in the West. This policy underscored the South's growing influence over national politics and exacerbated sectional tensions. Economic policy also widened the North-South divide, particularly through the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. This high tariff was designed to protect northern industries but hurt the agricultural South, which relied on imported goods and resented paying higher prices. Southern leaders, especially John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, reacted strongly to the tariff, claiming the right of nullification, the idea that a state could invalidate federal laws it deemed unconstitutional. This led to the nullification crisis, which was ultimately diffused through a compromise tariff in 1833. But the crisis highlighted how economic differences could quickly escalate into threats of disunion. The tension over slavery was also evident in the gag rule, a series of congressional resolutions that prevented the discussion of anti-slavery petitions from 1836 to 1844. Southern Democrats pushed for the rule to silence Northern abolitionists and preserve the institution of slavery, further inflaming sectional animosity. While the gag rule succeeded in stifling debate temporarily, it outraged many in the North and contributed to a growing sense that Southern interests dominated national politics at the expense of free speech and abolitionist efforts. Another major source of conflict was Jackson's war on the Second Bank of the United States. Jackson believed the bank primarily served Northern industrial and financial interests at the expense of Southern and Western farmers. His dismantling of the bank in the 1830s pleased his Southern supporters, but alienated many in the North, where the bank had more substantial presence. Jackson's decision to move federal deposits into state banks, or pet banks, deepened the economic rift between North and South, as Northern banking and commercial elites saw the move as a destabilizing blow to the national economy. In response to Jackson's policies, the Whig Party emerged in the 1830s as a coalition of diverse groups, including former National Republicans, anti-Masons, and disaffected Democrats. The Whigs were more prevalent in the North and opposed what they saw as Jackson's excessive use of executive power, particularly his attacks on the bank and his tendency to act unilaterally. While the Whigs drew significant support from Northern industrialists and urban centers, they struggled to unify a platform that could bridge the deepening sectional divide. In these ways, Jacksonian Democrats and their political opponents wrestled with the growing economic, political, and cultural differences between the North and South. While temporary compromises were made, the policies and conflicts of the Jacksonian era foreshadowed the more serious sectional crises that would come to a head in the decades leading up to the Civil War.